So that's what, 52 years, 62 years? My dad arrived as a young kid in Israel in 1949, after World War II. Didn't have shoes to wear. They lived in tents when they first got there. In 62 years, they became integral to the world economy. Today, if you look at their economy, I think we would like to have their economy today. Now, granted, we have more per capita income and stuff like that, but if you look at where the growth is, people would love to have the growth in the economy in the United States that Israel has, and they're fastly catching up to Europe in gross national product per capita. It's just amazing. And I wish I had found the article. I read an article a few weeks ago talking about the Americans' return to Israel. And it's talked about how, that over the next 15, 20 years, maybe like my kids, that the opportunities for Jewish people are going to be so much greater in Israel than they are here, and Israel's going to be welcoming, they're going to need, that they're going to be, it was that, okay, they came from Russia, they came from, my dad came from war-torn Europe. They came from, in the 90s, they came from Russia. They came from Africa, from the Arab countries in the 40s and 50s. But it's going to be so prosperous there in the next 20 years that the Jews from America are going to be moving there. Okay, I mean that's what God's doing, and that's in the midst of unbelief. And what does Paul say in Romans? If their unbelief, if their rejection leads to the blessing that we have through Christ, how much more blessing will we have when they accept the Lord? But I think what we're starting to see is a foreshadow of that. I only say that so you realize God has not taken his hand off of Israel. Okay? And we'll get into, I know there's some issues, I don't know if Matt ever dealt with this, but is this the return before the Lord's return? And I'm firmly convinced the scriptures, and we'll go through that the verse that I hang my hat on with that, as to why I believe that this nation of Israel we see now is the nation of Israel that's going to go through the tribulation. And you think about why are all these nations going to come against Israel? I think it's going to be because they're going to be so enraged with how well they're doing compared to the rest of the world, and they're going to be So anyway, that's just, again, I can't prove that from Scripture what I just said there, but I think we can prove from Scripture that this nation of Israel is the nation of Israel that will go through the tribulation. The question is it next week? Is it next year? Is it next decade? Is it 50 years from now? We don't know that, but I believe that what we see here, and I thought, I remember back about 2000. We were planning on, when Lauren and I were in ministry, we did a lot of work with youth, and we were planning on taking a youth group over to Israel. And I think it was in 1999. And all that they had the Infada, and I'm like, well, I guess we can't really take a bunch of teenagers over to Israel during this. And I'm always thinking, like, well, how much longer can this go on? How much more can they take? Something's got to give with this, and yet it keeps prospering and keep going on, and so it could be a long time. That's my whole point. Is we're thinking, oh my gosh, God's got to return in the next week, or Israel's doomed, and Israel's military is so superior that it can ward off large things. And speaking of that, one of the things that this book brings out is the reason that they have done so well. And this is where God what you meant for evil, God turns for good. What Satan meant for evil in attacking Israel, God turned to good. Because what they're saying in this book is it is the military training that the average Israeli gets that makes them so successful in business. That they've learned to think so critically and so quickly, and they're not afraid of failure. Because they live, when they're on the battlefield, they live like they're going to, they could die any moment. So what's a business decision to them? And so they're kind of, and in one sense, it makes them kind of ruthless in business. And I'll read a little. Lauren didn't want me to read this, but I just thought it was so good. Well, she thinks maybe it's a little derogatory, but I don't think it's meant in that light. If I could find it. How many people know Israelis, have dealt with Israelis at all? Okay, so maybe you might get this. There's 4 guys standing on a street corner. An American, a Russian, maybe a Ukrainian, not a Russian, a Ukrainian, a Chinese man, and an Israeli. I know Lauren walks in there, she's going to be like, oh, I can't believe he's telling that. A reporter comes up to the group and says to them, excuse me, what's your opinion on the meat shortage? The American says, what's a shortage? Right? The Ukrainian says, what's meat? The Chinese man says, what's an opinion? Right? The Israeli says, what's excuse me? and again, but that ruthless attitude that they have, and they can be very abrupt, has made them tigers in business. And God, like I said, what Satan meant for evil, God has turned for good and has used it to make it a prosperous nation. Now, we've got 8 minutes. I don't really want to start on the covenants, except I'll just maybe do a little bit of introduction on the covenants, and then next week we'll get into this chart here, going over God's covenants with Israel. As a way of introduction, there's really 2 types of covenants that God has made with the nation of Israel. Conditional and unconditional. Now, the conditional covenant was the Mosaic and was temporary. We'll go through that. And then the unconditional are eternal. Okay? Now, 4 points about that. They are literal. Okay? And so we're not going to have to spend a lot of time reading them and trying to figure out what God's saying. The covenants are pretty clear what God's saying. Number 2, we said the eternal, the unconditional ones are eternal. They really depend solely on God's, on God. It's not something that Israel does, although we'll talk about there are ramifications for disobedience even under an eternal, unconditional covenant. And it's made with the covenant nation of Israel. Although we'll see that Paul talks about how the blessings, there are blessings from the covenants that go to the nations and to the church. Okay. But that doesn't mean that the covenant is with the nation, with the church, or with the nations. They are still with Israel. Now, the Mosaic Law was written in a very unique form. Does anybody know? I know Matt will know this, so I won't ask Matt. But does anybody know what form that the Mosaic covenant was written in? Anybody? Good. Let's see if you can say this. Repeat after me. Suzerain vassal treaty. Say that.
Suzerain vassal treaty.
Suzerain vassal treaty. Now, this was a treaty done in the Near East. There was a suzerain and a vassal. Okay? Hence, suzerain vassal treaty. The suzerain was the superior. Okay? And the vassal was the inferior. Okay? The suzerain basically was kind of a protector of the inferior, and he says, if I, basically it's like this, I'm so great that if you will do this for me, do these things, here's what I will do for you. And so the vassal pledges their obedience to the suzerain, and the suzerain gives blessings and protection to the vassal. And that's the form, and there is some very specific ways that it's written. We won't get into, but realize that it's written actually it uses Near East language. They would have been somewhat familiar with this, and it's written in a way where it is. That's how we know it's conditional, because Suzerain Vassal Treaty was conditional on that, and it required, and we'll see through this, it required obedience from the people, whereas an unconditional covenant actually does still require obedience, but the covenant isn't broken by disobedience. It's only the blessings are kind of pushed off on them, but the covenant is eternal. So I'm going to end there. Just as kind of, does anybody have any questions or comments or they want to make want to say tonight? Anything? No. Okay. I'm glad that you hopefully you got a little bit of humor out of my Savannah thing, and the point I'm trying to get is the church needs to stay on course and focus. And I truly think that remember, who is the ultimate Israel in the Scripture? Jesus the Messiah. So when we focus on Israel, the real goal is to focus on the Messiah. Yes?
When you're using the illustration of getting off track, do you have a specific example or something in mind as far as...
Oh, I don't know if you were here when I said it. When they started to allegorise the Scripture and they started to spiritualize the promises to Israel and apply them to the church, that's where I believe they went off.
Oh, okay.
And I said, I think that really, it didn't just play into, what you think about Israel and the church. It really even got into aspects of salvation, too. And I know, I know, like, if you look at some, and I don't want to get into all the different positions on Calvinism, but there's a four. I'm not a Calvinist, by the way, but there's a big difference between a 4-point Calvinist and a 5-point Calvinist. The 5-point Calvinist would hold to limited atonement, and in limited atonement, the verses they use to prove limited atonement are verses that Jesus is talking about Israel. Another example would be when you look in the Westminster Confession, and they talk about infant baptism. The verses they use are when you look up the reference verses from the Westminster Confession, they're talking about circumcision, but they apply it to infant baptism. And I don't know how they do that. Okay, I mean, I really don't. I mean, we had a friend come over, and we knew actually in New York City, and she was staying with us because she was taking some class, and she started telling us that she was struggling because her husband started to get into more reform type stuff, and she showed me this stuff in the Westminster Confession, and I'm like, well, I just don't know how they get this. I mean, they say, they talk about infant baptism, and then they give okay, here's a scripture that supports it, and the scripture that supports infant baptism is circumcision. Okay, so I'm saying it's not. It's a huge error. It's not just a little. We don't really understand eschatology. They got their eschatology wrong. No, they got lots wrong. Okay, and I'm not here to bash anybody, but I'm just saying that when you get that one little thing wrong, you can get a lot of other things wrong. Yes.
Is Mitch? Did Mitch ever get back to New Jersey?
He got back to New York.
New York.
There's a lot of other stories. I'll tell you another story. He comes down. He doesn't drive a lot, so he drives down here, and his tires are kind of starting to rot because they don't wear out because he's got like 15,000 miles on his 2000 car, like that. And he's like, I want to get tires. And I said, well, there's a tire place right down the street. We can just go over there. We'll get some tires. No, I want to get used tires. I'm like, where do I get used tires around? I don't even know. I finally find this junkyard like an hour away. And we go over to this junkyard, we get these tires, and I'm thinking, okay, how's he going to get them on the car? So he calls AAA, and I'm like, I have nothing to do with this. He calls AAA and he says, my car's stalled. Can you come out and help me with my car? And AAA comes out. When AAA comes out, he goes, well, I'm going to give the guy $5. And he'll put on my tires. I'm like, for $5, the guy's going to put in your tires. But he asked the AAA guy. This is like what we call in New York. Us Jewish people call chutzpah. Can you say that? Chutzpah. I'm like, I've got nothing to do. I don't even want to know what you're doing. But remember that? Do you remember that, Lauren? Yeah, she's shaking her head. Yeah. I was like, So anyway, that's like I'll just give him $5. He'll come out, he'll change the tires, and he did, and I was able to go home. He had safe tires on the way home, and what'd you say?
I said a smart cookie.
Yeah, but it's not the way we wouldn't think like that. We'd be like, okay, I better go take him and get him. So he got back there, and he still calls, and not every time I talk to him, God gives me an opportunity to share about Jesus, and God has probably brought, I'm going to say 50, through the time I've known him, 50 believers in his life. And he'll call me up and say, you'll never get who I ran into today. He says, I ran into another born againer, and born again. And he'll just go on and on and on, and so we, Matt, you met Mitch.
I remember when
you remember you came over to our house. You came over and you met him.
That's right. We did. We ate together.
You ate.
That's right.
And you got the blessing of listening to him talk for hours and hours and hours. I'm like, ooh, I get to leave the room now.